Hey there, and welcome to MTG Meow, Magic Enjoyed Other Ways.
Meow.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Abby.
And today we're going to be looking at, as you can probably tell, the Star Wars The Gathering Magic set.
Yeah.
So last time, Abby and I, we played the Pokemon Magic set that we'd worked on together for a long time.
Yep.
But now we want to really explore other sets that other people have made.
Mm-hmm.
And this Star Wars The Gathering set was... is really popular. It was posted about a year ago, and it's had a couple expansions since then. And as you can tell, just, taking a look at just a couple of the cards here, it looks very well made. It has a lot of attention to detail. Looks very similar to a set that, Wizards would just put out normally.
Yeah, and and it's even got a couple cards, from Magic sets in there.
That's true. Arrest. It has reprints in it. So very cool. Very nicely done. Mm-hmm. And obviously, if you want to download it yourself and play it with your friends, the link is right in the description. So take a look at that. And what Abby and I are going to do here, we're just going to do pretty much the same thing with this set that we did with the Pokemon set. We're going to first we're going to do an intro. We'll just kind of go over the themes and the mechanics of the set in this video. And then in the next few videos, we'll do some exhibition matches of kind of like the themes of the set pitted against each other. And then we'll do a sealed, we'll do a draft, and then at the end, we'll do our review of the set to let you know if, this is something you should rush out and print and play or play on the computer, or if it's something, take your time to work your way to it.
Maybe if it's a rainy day.
Exactly. So, one thing that we do have to keep in mind is that Abby and I, like we said in the Pokemon video, we drafted that Pokemon video hundreds of times.
Oh my god.
Tons of Winston drafts and drafts with friends and play tests and whatever. But this Star Wars set, we didn't make it. So we're pretty much just as new to seeing this as you guys are. So the exhibition decks that we make, they're obviously not going to be tuned and perfect. We might make some mistakes. Might not play perfectly optimally.
Yeah.
But I think that's all part of how most people engage with a normal Magic set. Anyway, you don't go into a set being a pro right away. It takes a lot of experience with it.
Yeah. So when I first played the Pokemon set, I remember I was terrible at playing it, and I lost every time, and then.
Yeah, and that's all a part of...
Practice makes perfect.
That's all a part of every Magic set. No one starts off being a master drafter of any set. It takes a bunch of drafts, it takes a lot of getting familiar with the cards and interactions until you feel more comfortable with it.
Exactly.
So, what we're going to do in this video, like we said, we're just going to look at some themes and mechanics in the set, so why don't we get started with that? So one thing I really like about this set, just taking a look at it briefly, is how it divides the Star Wars universe into the Magic colors.
Yeah,
so
I was surprised at that too, to be honest.
It's surprised in a good way.
Yeah.
And what it does is it takes the Star Wars universe and divides it into 5 factions. So you have the Jedi, the Sith, the droids, the bounty hunters, and the monsters. And let me show you what I mean by that. So we'll look up one of the most famous Jedi. We'll look up Luke. So Luke is obviously a Jedi. You can see right here. And he's in Bant colors. So green, white, and red. So that's the Jedi faction is green, white, and blue. I think I said red. So that's the Jedi faction. We can take a look at Luke while we're here. He has lifelink and vigilance. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on him. Then you can remove all counters from him to give him hexproof, and obviously you have to remove at least 1 counter to do this. So it's a very interesting card. It synergizes with kind of the Jedi mechanic of the set, which is another cool thing because each of the factions, which they're all triple color, just like Shards of Alara, they're all a different shard.
Yeah.
So we have Bant, Grixis, Jund, etc. Mm-hmm. And each of those shards has their own mechanic, and Luke kind of synergizes with the Jedi mechanic, which we'll see in a minute.
That's cool.
So that's the Jedis. They're Bant. Next we have... we might as well go from Jedis to the Sith.
Aha! Daddy!
Yes. So we have the Sith, who are blue, black, red, Grixis. So we'll have one of the most famous Sith here, which is Anakin Skywalker, a.k.a. Darth Vader. So he has, whenever another creature dies, put +1/+1 counter on him, sacrifice a creature to give someone -1/-1, and then if he would be destroyed, you regenerate him and transform him into Darth Vader, the only flip card in the set, but very appropriate.
Oh, extremely.
So he has Menace and Lifelink, and whenever he attacks, creatures the defending player control gets -1/-1 until end of turn for each +1/+1 counter on him, which might not make a ton of sense right away, but you remember that the counters stay on him from this side, so if a lot of creatures die while he's Anakin, then more creatures will die when he is turned into Darth Vader, thanks to his ability. So That's the Sith, so they're the Grixis colors. Next up, we have the droids. So here's General Grievous. The droids are almost all, I believe they're almost all artifacts, if not all artifacts, and they are white, blue, and black. So Esper colors. So for General Grievous here, we have Double Strike. Makes sense. He's got a lot of arms. And whenever another creature dies, you can put a +1/+1 counter on him, and you can remove 2 +1/+1 counters to return him to his hand. So he can save himself, basically, which, again, makes sense for the General Grievous character.
Yeah, exactly. And he's a freaking robot, you know?
Well, yeah, all the droids are robots, they're all artifacts, they're all Esper colors, and that's that faction. And then the next faction is the Bounty Hunters. So here we have probably the most famous bounty hunter in the Star Wars universe. They're all Jund colors, I should say. They're black, red, and green. That's their colors. We have Boba Fett. So he has Menace, Death Touch, Haste. And when he enters the battlefield, you put a bounty counter on target creature.
That's pretty beastly.
And then whenever a creature with a bounty counter on it dies, you can draw 2 cards, and then you have to discard 2 cards. So it helps you filter through what you need.
We've seen that before in other sets, and it's more of a help than a hindrance. So.
Yes, and as you're seeing with some of these cards we're looking at, the bounty counters, that's kind of the bounty hunter mechanics. So we'll see more of that when we look at the mechanics. Right now we're just looking at the divisions. And the last one is the monsters. So the monsters are red, green, and also white. So this one, I just picked this one to show because it's probably the most famous monster, the Sarlacc Pit.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So Sarlacc Pit has Defender and Hexproof. It's not going anywhere, and you can't hurt it. But you can also monstrosity it. So monstrosity, if you remember, comes from Theros. It's a repeated mechanic where you can make something monstrous and then only once per game. And then when it becomes monstrous, it loses Hexproof and gains First Strike and Death Touch. So it's just kind of sitting there, First Striking and Death Touch and everything that's coming in.
Oh my god.
And just so we can show off a bit more, so more of the monsters, here's one that's red, green, and white, Naya colors, the Rancor that Luke had to fight in Return of the Jedi.
Oh yeah.
So also it's huge, 7/7, trample, monstrosity, make it into a 10/10, and it gives all your guys menace as long as it's monstrous.
Nasty.
So that's all the factions. As you can see, they're divided into 3 colors, and all of them work really well, I think. So that was a very kind of ingenious dividing of the Star Wars universe. It seems kind of obvious when you look at it now, but when you're sitting there on the blank slate figuring out how to do this, it's not quite obvious. It probably took a lot of trial and error to get it this nicely done.
Yeah.
So now why don't we take a look at some of the mechanics for each of them. So for the Jedi, who again are Bant colors, green, white, and blue, we have Meditate. So Meditate says that you can return this creature to your hand as a sorcery. And that might not seem so great at first, but almost all of them have either an enters the battlefield ability, like this guy, where you can put a +1/+1 counter on someone, or a leaves the battlefield ability. So it seems very good, because being able to play your guys over and over again, or if they have a bad aura enchanted on them or something, you can get rid of that by returning them to your hand.
That's true.
So there just seems to be a lot of value in being able to return them to your hand and then playing them again.
It just seems like it's a bummer that you can only use it as a sorcery. You know?
Well,
would it be too strong?
Yeah, it would either have to be much more costly. Like this would have to cost 4 or 5, if not more, to meditate. Or it would just be completely broken, because like you could say, oh, I'll target your Jedi instructor with a Doom Blade. Oh, in response, I'll meditate it, and it just negates all removal spells. So it's just not fun. I think meditating only as a sorcery was a very good choice. The thing that I'm worried about, though, before we playtest this, is I'm worried a little bit about the repetitiveness of this mechanic, because I think in the early and mid-game, it's fine. Maybe you'll return one guy to your hand to get an extra +1/+1 counter or whatever. But I think by the time you get to the late game and you have 8, 9, even 10 mana out, it's gonna be correct to constantly being returning these guys to your hand and playing them and returning them and playing them and getting the value over and over again. Yeah. And I just don't want that to become repetitive.
Yeah, that becomes a little cumbersome, and then nobody's really having fun except you, and then it's one of those asshole things. So. Yeah, so I'm anxious too to see how this will work out when we test play it. So.
Right, so that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. Next up, we have the droids, who again are Esper colors, so white, blue, black. Their mechanic is Repair, as we can see on this guy. So he has Repair 2, And that says when this creature dies, you put 2 repair counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove a repair counter, and when the last is removed, you can cast it from your graveyard until end of turn.
Wow.
So there's a couple of unintuitive things going on here that we should look at real quick. So first of all, it doesn't exile itself or anything for the counters. Usually we're used to counters being placed on exiled cards. This is just the card is in your graveyard and it has counters on it.
Huh.
So it's a little weird.
Yeah, that is kind of
weird. It's reminiscent of kind of this card, Skullbriar, the Walking Grave from the Commander expansion, where it retains counters on it in any zone, either exile or command zone or graveyard or whatever. I'm a little wary of that kind of, because again, this Skullbriar was a rare, and this, keeping count of counters in the graveyard on a common.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem worth it, really.
We'll see how it goes. It seems like it could be a little complex, but we'll see. And then the last thing is you don't cast it for free, like suspend or something. You have to pay for it when you cast it, and then if you don't, it just stays in your graveyard. So you have to make the decision right then and there. So it's just a couple of not quite intuitive things to keep in mind for this one. I'm a little bit concerned that this one might be kind of complicated, but again, similar to the Jedi mechanic, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, exactly. I'm anxious to see how this works in the test matches.
Yes. All right, next up we have the Sith mechanic. Sith, again, are Grixis, so they're black, red, and blue, which is hate. So hate says, usually if an opponent lost life from a source other than combat damage. So if you attack and deal damage, who cares? It doesn't do anything. But if you lightning bolt your opponent for 3 damage, then it does something. So for example, we have Sith Assassin here, and that says when he enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life from a source other than combat damage this turn, you can destroy a non-black creature. So very strong if you can turn on the hate, not so strong if you can't.
Yeah.
So again, kind of similar to the other mechanics that we're talking about. I'm a little concerned about this one because there are ways in the set for you to kind of trigger the hate and make sure that your opponent's losing life, like this one, this Neophyte Hate Flare, which is a common, where you can pay a life and each opponent loses 1 life. So there's support for the hate mechanic, but I'm just worried if there's not enough ways to trigger hate, then your cards are just going to be coming down and they're just going to feel kind of useless. I mean, like, you don't really want to just put a 3-mana 3/2 in your deck. You want them to do stuff.
Yeah.
As opposed to, you can remember the Bloodthirst mechanic from normal Magic, which says just if an opponent was dealt damage this turn, then you get the +1/+1 counter bonus, which is a lot easier through combat. So I understand that the person who created this wanted it to differentiate their mechanic from Bloodthirst, but again, I'm very interested to see if there's enough support for this hate mechanic in the set while we play it. All right.
Seems sort of iffy, but I'm anxious too to see how it works out.
All right, and then the next one, we have the Bounty Hunter mechanic. Bounty Hunters, again, are Jund, so they're black, green, and red. Their mechanic is Bounty, which says usually whenever a creature an opponent controls with a bounty counter on it dies, something happens. So for example, with this Novice Bounty Hunter, whenever a creature an opponent controls with a bounty counter on it dies, it deals 2 damage to target player. So yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's again, it has me kind of thinking the same kind of thing as the hate mechanic, where if you don't have a specific way to make the opponent lose life, hate doesn't do much. And if you don't have a specific way to put bounty counters on the opponent's creatures, then it's not going to do much.
Right.
Thankfully, there are a lot of cards that put bounty counters on your opponent's creatures, like this card, Headhunting, which it's kind of a really cool card. It just puts a bounty counter on a creature, makes each opponent lose life, and you draw a card, so it kind of does everything you want. It turns on hate with the lose life, turns on bounty with this one, and it replaces itself, so it's very nice.
Yeah, that's a good card.
So there is quite a bit of support for the bounty counters, but again, that's something we'll have to keep in mind as we go along. One thing it reminds me of is from the ingest mechanic from Battle for Zendikar, where, if you had a lot of ingesters ingesting and exiling the cards from your opponent, then great, but they don't really do anything on their own. You needed the processors in order to kind of take advantage of that. So that's what it kind of feels like here to me, where, you can put a ton of bounty counters on, your opponent's creatures, but you also need the hunters to take advantage of it, whereas vice versa, if you have a lot of hunters and no bounty, then nothing happens. So again, something that we're going to definitely keep in mind as we play the set. And then lastly, we have the monsters.
Ooh.
So the monsters, as we saw, are Naya colors. They're green, white, and red. And their mechanic is monstrosity, which is, again, if you're not familiar with it, from Theros. Monstrosity, it's just a repeated mechanic. I think it works perfectly here.
Yeah.
Just embodies monsters just becoming huge and attacking.
Yeah,
So-
just getting stuff done and
Getting stuff done.
beating face,
Yeah.
big fatties. I like this card in particular, a massive swarm.
It's not a massive. It's massive.
I said massive.
Oh, okay. So yeah.
Massive.
So one thing I'm
swarm.
interested in, one thing I'm interested to see is how much +1/+1 counter support there is in the set. Like, does the set do things with +1/+1 counters,
Yeah.
or does it just kind of leave monstrosity as its own bonus? So that's something for us to keep in mind as we look at it. All right, and lastly, we have kind of one of the last mechanics of the set, which is space flight, which says that this creature can only block or be blocked by creatures with space flight. So that might seem a little strange at first, but I actually really like this mechanic because it kind of differentiates between the battle in space versus the battle on the ground.
Yeah, no, I like it because of that too.
And it's like, yeah, sure, you have all these monsters on the ground that are huge, but they can't touch these guys that are way up in space. And also, these guys in space aren't going to come down and deal with things that are
Yeah,
on the
they're
ground.
not exactly swooping out of the clouds and shooting at tauntauns or
Yeah.
something. It's not.
Occasionally we'll see, some creatures with spaceflight that do interfere with things on the ground in their own
really?
way, but yeah, we'll see how it goes.
What?
And I really like the creator's choice to put this in the future sight frame to even differentiate it even more. So.
Yeah, that was an interesting touch. I agree with that as well.
And the last kind of mechanic in the set is the troopers. So the stormtroopers are kind of like slivers in the set. They're in every color, white, blue, black, red, green, and they all give bonuses to all the other troopers. So like right here we have Scout Trooper that gives +1/+1 to all other troopers. We have ones that give them Death Touch,
Yeah.
Haste, whatever. So
That's very reminiscent of slivers, yeah.
yeah, yes, Abbey, that's what I just said. Very good.
Whatever.
So that's pretty much an intro to the set. So we've seen the Jedi mechanic, Sith mechanic, the droid mechanic, the bounty hunter mechanic,
Yeah.
and the monster mechanic, plus space flight and the troopers. There's of course a
Yeah.
few other little goodies hidden in there,
Definitely.
but we'll see them as we play the set. So things that we're going to keep an eye on as we play, we want to keep an eye on how complex the mechanics are. Do they work together with the rest of the set nicely?
Yeah, the fluidity of everything, yeah.
And one other thing I really want to keep in mind when we play is, one of the difficulties of making a Star Wars set is like, sure, everyone wants to play with like a Luke or Darth Vader in their deck, right?
I guess,
but Luke is a mythic rare, and Darth Vader's a mythic rare. So how did this creator bring like the Star Wars that everybody knows to commons and uncommons? That's what I really want to see. Because if you sit down and tell your friends, hey, we're going to draft the Star Wars set, and your friends love Star Wars, they might not want to play with a ton of Scout Troopers. I mean, maybe they would, but they might want to play with
Anyone who likes to beat face would love to have a bunch of Scout
Yeah, it
Troopers.
depends on how much they love Magic versus how much they love Star Wars. If
That's true.
they really like Magic and are just kind of, I like Star Wars, then sure, that might be fine. But if they're really into Star Wars and just kind of have a passing knowledge of Magic, and you want to maybe use this to get them to play
and
more,
if they're rebels versus Empire, and they're it depends on what faction they align with.
Yeah, I think you can certainly build some fun decks with your opponent, and you can throw, a Darth Vader in there or whatever for them. But if you're doing a draft or whatever with your friends, I'm very interested to see how this creator brings the Star Wars universe that people are familiar with to common and uncommon.
Yeah.
So to that end, what we'll do next is Abby and I created some exhibition decks for you guys. We created a Jedi deck, Sith deck, a droid deck, and a bounty hunter deck, and a monster deck, and a trooper deck. So we have 6 decks. So we're going to slam them against each other in the next videos, and we're just to give us a feel for the set before we draft it and play sealed, because we don't want to go completely blind into that. It would kind of be a mess.
Yeah, that would be terrible.
All right, so we're interested to see how the matches go. First up is, of course, going to be Jedi versus Sith.
Oh yeah, the ultimate battle.
Let's see how it goes.